Hello, today we're going to interview Doug Wead from DougWead.com. He's a New York Times best-selling author and an advisor to two American presidents. There isn't anybody I could think of who would be more qualified to give their expert opinion on who they think would be the greatest or the best president. Stay tuned for a fascinating interview. Hello, I want to welcome today, we have Doug Wead. He's a New York Times best-selling author and the advisor to two American presidents. He's written over 30 books, one he co-authored with President H.W. Bush. He's interviewed 6 of the presidents and first ladies, 19 of the presidential children, and 12 of the presidential siblings. He served as the special assistant to the president in the senior Bush White House. He co-founded Mercy Corps that's done over $2 billion of food and medicine worldwide to help people. Doug, I want to welcome you today.
Thank you, Andrea. Great to be with you.
Thank you so much. I want to get right to the question. Doug, with all of your experience in research as a presidential historian, and with your trilogy of books, you wrote The Raising of a President, that's fascinating, All the President's Children, and your upcoming trilogy, the Sibling Rivalry, your third book that I'm excited to hear about. Can you share with us who you think would be the best and greatest presidents and why?
Well, I think George Washington was a great president because he set the precedent for so much of what followed. He very easily could have shaped the presidency into an absolute dictatorship, but he was very careful to preserve the original spirit of the American Revolution and the original dream of these founding documents and the founding fathers. And he walked away from power. You don't see that. People are dragged away from power, kicking and screaming. He may be the only person who left the White House joyful.
Wow.
But I take that back. The White House wasn't built yet.
Absolutely, and George Washington is someone that we all need to know. Currently, I'm studying for my citizenship, and he's the first one that we study. And some of his attributes, would you say that he was a generous president?
Yes, he was very generous in spirit and in heart. The more you study these presidents, the more human they become. For example, George Washington had a romance with his neighbor's wife. He started corresponding with her again when he was leaving the presidency, when he was in New York. We don't like to talk about that. He wore wooden teeth, so he kept his mouth shut. A lot of the times when people thought he was so wise and so dignified, it had to do with him being self-conscious about his wooden teeth. He'd just keep his mouth shut and stand there with dignity. So the more you study these people, the more human they become. But I think the fact that Americans idealize and make heroes out of their presidents reveals more about them than it does the presidents. We want to have heroes, and we want them up there in marble on pedestals, and that tells a little bit about who we are.
That's very true. Do you have any other examples of a president that you think is a great leader?
Yes, many. Most of the presidents were great leaders, some good or bad, and there are institutes, the Siena Institutes and others that have their rankings of the great presidents. It's almost always political. It has to be. That's the nature of things. But FDR is rated often as a great president. And Abraham Lincoln, of course, is a great president because he held the Union together. There are revisionist historians who are troubled by, for example, Lincoln's canceling of the writ of habeas corpus and other very hard decisions that he had to take to hold the Union together. And so you constantly have revisionists. Theodore Roosevelt is seen as a great president. But again, there are revisionists in history who say, well, Teddy Roosevelt started a war with Colombia, created a nation that never previously existed, Panama, so that we could build a canal and have our Navy on two oceans, the Pacific and the Atlantic, and move them back and forth quickly for our defense. Today, we're criticizing Russia because it is occupying the Crimea, and it's really much more complicated than that. The first capital of Russia was Kiev, which is the capital of the Ukraine, and Sevastopol, the great port in the Crimea, has been Russia's outlet to the Black Sea for many, many generations, as long as America's been a country. So the United States seized the Panamanian region, made a deal with 15 prominent oligarch families there, created a country that had never existed, Panama, so we could have our canal for defensive purposes, and nations continue to do that. But we call Theodore Roosevelt a great president. He was a great president. He's up there on Mount Rushmore. But these great presidents are also quite controversial. Theodore Roosevelt once said, every generation needs to taste a war, a good war. Well, if Hitler said something like that, it put chills down our spine. Because it was Theodore Roosevelt, we, we take that in good humor and dismiss it. But Theodore Roosevelt definitely, Abraham Lincoln, Ronald Reagan, who ended the Cold War. We have to remember, going into the Reagan era, people were describing it as the time of the Soviets. It was the time for communism. Henry Kissinger was picked up by a microphone at a social event in Canada, saying to his dinner partner that this is the era of the Soviet Union, acknowledging the transcendent power of the Soviet Union and of communism, and that it was seen that we couldn't keep our fingers in the dike, we couldn't stop it from happening worldwide. But Ronald Reagan had the vision to see that this was corrupt, and we had to call it corrupt and to stand up to it. Very unpopular in the media at the time. Now everybody loves him. Back then, he was called a warmonger, a racist. He had a lot of charges were leveled at him. But he stayed true to his purpose, and he ended the Cold War. You could say Abraham Lincoln saved the nation, and you could say that Ronald Reagan saved the world by ending the Cold War and ending this threat of nuclear annihilation between the two superpowers. So those are a few of the great presidents.
Well, that's wonderful. And when I was studying your website and I was having a look at some of the things that you had talked about, you talked about a formula for leadership that I thought was very powerful, and a mama's boy and an absent father. Can you give some examples of where you've seen that with some of the presidents?
Yes, this was not something, Andrea, that I was looking for. This was something that forced itself on me. It's unavoidable. Most of the American presidents, in fact, most leaders in history tend to be mama's boys, and they usually have an absent father somewhere in the story. This isn't a law or a rule. It isn't absolute. It isn't universal, but it's very, very common. Washington, great leaders, Jefferson, evil leaders, Stalin, Hitler, all mama's boys with a father who died when they were young or abandoned the family. Barack Obama's father walked out on the family when he was 2 years old. Even the candidates that run, John McCain, his father was never home. George Herbert Walker Bush says, I was never there. Barbara raised him. And this is a very common experience. In fact, many of the American presidents are literally named after their mother. Ronald Wilson Reagan is named after his mother, Nellie Wilson. And we know the Kennedys. There were many Kennedy boys, but only one was named after his mother, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, named after Rose Fitzgerald. You can go all the way back into history. Rutherford Burchard Hayes, named after his mother, Sophia Burchard. And Franklin Delano Roosevelt, named after his mother, Sarah Delano. In fact, she used to say to him, "You're a Delano, you're not a Roosevelt, you're a Delano." And Lyndon Baines Johnson, named after his mother, Rebecca Baines. Richard Milhouse Nixon, named after his mother, Hannah Milhouse. It goes all the way back into history. When I first started writing about this, I had historians write me back, said, "I never have noticed that before." They said it sent chills down our spine when we would read it. It is an uncanny, either it's a coincidence or something's going on here. And I've been studying it for many years, and I think I understand what's going on. What troubled me is that America's prisons are filled with young men who are mama's boys who have an absent father.
Wow.
So I'm thinking, wait a second, is this some terrible poison that destroys most men, but for some odd reason, this is very Nietzsche, but for some odd reason it provokes greatness in a few anomalies, in a few men? And for a while, that's what I thought, until one day I was going to a TV show, and my chauffeur, my driver, I was explaining this to him to get his opinion. He said, "Well, have you ever studied those absent fathers?" I said, "What do you mean?" "Well, they're absent fathers, but did you do their bios? What did the son think of that absent father?" And bingo, that was the difference. Many people whose lives end tragically have an absent father who they despise and who hurt them, and they are in anger. And others have internalized this and see their fathers as heroic, even though they're absent. McCain's father was this great admiral. Obama, when he speaks of his father, he writes, "Dreams of my father." He sees his father as a man of integrity, not as someone who abandoned him, but as someone who went back to Africa. And all these Africans would go to France or England or America, they'd get their education and they'd promise, "I'm going to come back and help you. Don't worry, I'll be right back here to help you." But they all would go on to careers in the West. Obama's father came back to do something in his own country, in his own land. That's how Obama processed it. His father was a hero, not a villain. And that seems to be the formula. They have a mother who loves them. Sigmund Freud said that a man is empowered if he is perceived to be the favorite of his mother. They have this sense of empowerment from the mother who loves them, and they have this sense of challenge to prove something to this absent father who they admire. It's a fascinating study.
It really is. And I wonder, does it go both ways for women? Was there any study? And that's another question that I wanted to ask you about the likelihood of us ever seeing women in office.
Well, I think we will see a woman president, and I think it could happen in 2016, could happen right away. But I believe we will see women elected to higher office. As far as understanding those dynamics, they don't automatically work in reverse. And it's going to take a lot of women leaders and women presidents before we can see a pattern like these patterns that we can see among the men. So I've thought about it, I've looked for patterns, but it's premature to know what's going on there in the relationship between a daughter and father and daughter and mother, and how they're challenged to do great things with their lives.
Wonderful. Well, if we could talk a little bit about President Obama and what you think, how is he doing as a great president?
Well, the election of Barack Obama is so historic. It is such a unusual moment in American history. I mean, these founding fathers who wrote these noble words, all men are created equal, owned slaves. And now an African American is president. It's I was asked by Katie Couric during the inauguration time, the first time around, for a historical comparison. You can't find a historical comparison for this moment within presidential history. You have to go outside of presidential history to the landing of a man on the moon or to Joan of Arc or to some other event in history to compare with the significance of the election of Barack Obama as president. So just his election and his re-election is itself a tremendous moment in history, a great moment and a linchpin, a turning moment in history. His actual presidency, as judged on itself, if it were purely judged on numbers, is really tough. You can't just blame it on your predecessor. Nixon, for example, he can say, well, Lyndon Johnson did the same thing, and Lyndon Johnson, but Richard Nixon is responsible for his presidency, the fact that he lost it politically and was forced to resign. He's responsible as president to anticipate that the public is changing, the attitude of the media is changing, that he could lose his presidency and not blame it on a predecessor. You can't say that John Tyler was a great president because he worked to bring Texas into the Union. You have to say that James K. Polk brought Texas into the Union, even though his predecessor laid the groundwork. You have to give credit to Bill Clinton for balancing the budget, even though his predecessor, Ronald Reagan, ended the Cold War, which allowed for the peace dividend a huge abundance of money available that was not previously available, that made it possible for a president to balance the budget. So you can't blame George W. Bush totally for the economic disaster of recent years under President Barack Obama. So if he's judged by unemployment rate and he's judged strictly by the numbers, the stimulus did not produce the jobs he said it would produce. By our own government records, his records, it produced none. The NSA, on the NSA watch, that could be very controversial in history, to have members of his own party say that they're being spied upon by the CIA. Those are those are going to be tough moments for historians to review and wonder about. And people of color and people of poverty are going to once more look for someone like Obama with humble origins and see if they can end the corruption, the economic corruption that has really paralyzed our economy and hurt our economy. Right now, you have corporate welfare, you have welfare of the poor, but you have great companies earning hundreds of millions of dollars off of the taxpayers' backs, and it's a tremendous drain on the economy. So the Obama presidency, great moment in history, his election. He has the political skills of a Ronald Reagan. He reminds me of Reagan because he does not become bitter over the attacks that he goes through and that he's experiencing. The actual numbers from unemployment and government numbers measuring the economy, for example, are not good, but it's not over. So we'll see what happens.
Right, and history does reveal itself. That's what I've learned from you. Now, on a personal note, though, he's doing very well with, raising his children in the public eye. He's brought an orderliness and discipline to his lifestyle. How does that affect the public's view of Obama and anyone else that has also been in the public eye?
Well, I think that Barack Obama and Michelle Obama are two of the best parents, presidential parents, that I've studied or seen. Most of these presidential parents are very indulgent. It's almost like they know they haven't been with their children like they should, and so out of guilt, they want to make up for it now that they're president. And they give them anything they want and lavish opportunity and power on them. That's very, very common. Lincoln, Grant, and even into modern times. But you don't see Obama's girls in the newspapers. They're not getting drunk. They're not in trouble at school. The Obamas have brought the two things that that we've learned are important in parenting, and that is love and structure. They've brought some discipline, which is very hard to do when you're in the White House because you're very, very busy. But they've been tremendous parents, and they have learned from the mistakes of many of their predecessors through history. And I think that Malia and Sasha are going to have a good life because of the structure that their parents have brought to them and the love. When I say the love, when the president says we're going to go to Chicago, he keeps his promise for the kids. And he's allowed them to experience history. He took them to Moscow with him. He's got a good balance between keeping them in school with everybody else and yet a perspective that this is not a normal situation. You're coming with me to South Africa and you're going to meet Mandela. So I really admire them as parents. They're great parents.
And I know that you've also had relationships with, like President Ford has been in your home. What was he like as a person, not just as a president?
Well, I tell you, it's very interesting. I have this theory about presidential candidates that I call dumb and duller. And that is, most Republican presidents throughout history, the public perceives them as dumb. Abraham Lincoln was referred to by one of his cabinet members to his wife in letters as our dear imbecile. And many people thought that Lincoln was out of his element. His stories that we have grown to love in history, people would roll their eyes when he would tell them in his own lifetime. They were homespun and they were considered country, and but Lincoln is considered a genius today. Gerald Ford was considered dumb. Ronald Reagan, they said, was dumb. The president I served, George Herbert Walker Bush, they used to make fun of him because he was the director of the CIA, but he'd read Robert Ludlum instead of John le Carré. So they said, oh, he's dumb. And of course, George W. Bush, everybody says, is dumb. but they aren't dumb.
Right.
And the Democrats, they would say, are dull. They'd say Dukakis is too dull. He's wooden. He's stiff. Gore, he's too dull. What's wrong with him? His speeches are boring. In 1988, Bill Clinton gave a speech to the Democrat National Convention, and they all went to sleep. It was an hour and a half long, and the TV cameras were showing pictures of people on the floor of the convention sleeping, and one of the commentators said on national TV, well, this guy's just ruined his political career. 4 years later, he was president of the United States. So I call it dumb and duller. And you look back to high school, who got elected president of the high school of your class or your room? It wasn't the richest or the smartest or the most popular especially or the best looking. There's another quality here. It's the art of offending the least. And what we see as boring is part of the science and the art of politics. And when I had Gerald Ford in my home, what shocked me was how smart he was. He's a policy wonk. So I thought I'd have some good conversations with him about policy and some of my views, and I was out of my league. I quickly realized I was totally uninformed on his level to talk policy. And that reminded me that it takes real skill to advance that far politically, and it takes talent. And it's not entertainment, it's not charisma. The things that make you a great entertainer are not the things that would make you a great politician. A great entertainer is charismatic, wants to make people laugh and cry. If you make people laugh and cry and you're a politician, you're in trouble.
See, it's so fascinating to hear your stories, Doug. I want to thank you so much. We're nearing the end of the time slot. I want to respect the time what we've got for you here. And I want to thank you so much for inspiring me. I heard you speak about over 10 years ago, and you boomed from the pulpit. You said, get up and make a difference. And it hit me here. I've got to do something more. So I want to thank you for the inspiration you've given me and for this of appearing in the Jumpstart to Success program. And I'm just curious, I want to end on, how did you decide to get involved in the White House? I can see some traces of it when I look at DougWead.com. I can see all about all the interviews you've done, all about your books, but where did it start for you?
For me, it started with wanting to help dying people in the famine in Cambodia. I went over there and tried to see if there was anything I could do. I think I just got in the way, but I kept persisting, and within a few days met with some other people, an entertainer, Pat Boone, and his son-in-law, Dan O'Neill, and Cardinal Law, the man who became the Cardinal of Boston, and we got some things going. And out of that came charitable work, and from the charitable work came a relationship with the Carters, and then the Reagans, and the Bushes, and on it went. So that's where it began. It began by wanting to feed people who were starving to death.
Wow. And your speech 10 years ago was about the triple braided cord and the relationships that you form over the years. And so you've just proven right there how important it is that when you're out doing things, that you never know who you're first of all inspiring and who you're going to end up working with.
That's very true. Congratulations on what you're doing. This is a great program.
Thank you so much, Doug. Well, I'll keep you posted. And if anyone wants to learn more about Doug Wead, DougWead.com. And you have a wonderful day today. Thank you.
Thank you. You too, Andrea.
Take care now.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.